Locked.
Hello again, and welcome back to another ClueCon Weekly. We're delighted this week to have in the ClueCon Weekly studio Jerry Eisner from Red Sky. Is it Red Sky Technologies, Jerry?
It is.
Excellent. And what kind of business is that?
So we provide 911 services to enterprises, to resellers, and to service providers. And it really comes down to three words: find, route, and notify. We help the end user, anybody that's using a telephone system, find their endpoints, whether on-prem or off-prem, hard phones or soft phones. We use the result of the find to route a 911 call anywhere in the United States and Canada based on their location. And then, as required by regulation, we notify the enterprise that somebody called 911, their callback number, and where the call came from.
Great. That sounds like a very, very valuable service to provide. And we will come back and talk a bit more about that in a moment. But before we do that, let's get to know you a bit, Jerry. Whereabouts is it that you are?
So today I'm on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. This is where home is. Red Sky is actually based in downtown Chicago, but with everybody working from home, it's been a while since I've been in the office.
Right, and under normal circumstances, would you spend time working from home, or would you be over in the office most weekdays?
So I commute. So typically Tuesday mornings I get up, head to CMH, hop on a Southwest flight, say hi to my friends, and I'm in the office by 9 o'clock in the morning. Thursday night, I wish everyone well in Chicago, and I'm home in time to take the trash out.
Great stuff. Oh, that's good. And Jerry, in order for people to get to know you a bit better, just in case they've not come across you before we get on to Red Sky and some of the stuff around that, can you tell us a little bit about your background and sort of career history that leads us up to the present day?
Sure. I've been in public safety communications for, this is year 35. I started out in two-way radio in Chicago, where some of my clients were police and fire departments, and I got to learn how important 24/7 coverage really was. After that, I did a bit of consulting where I really started to learn how 911 works on the database side, and it was primarily working for states and municipalities, helping them set up enhanced 911, which is location-based delivery. And after that, when the telecom bubble popped around 97, I went to work for what's now SunGuard, doing implementations of computer-aided dispatch and record systems. And that's where I started to learn data networking. A lot of our systems were token ring-based, and Ethernet was at its infancy. And then after that, much to my surprise, I was hired by Lucent Technologies. And in Lucent, public safety systems had three verticals. We had a computer-aided dispatch company. We had the CPE that the 911 call centers used to answer phones, but we also had Big Iron Database, which served somewhere in the neighborhood of like 70% of the 911 calls. And based on my experience, I figured they'd put me in the first two, and they put me on the Big Iron databases. My first project was bringing together GTE and NYNEX to create what everybody now calls Verizon, and dealing with all the political aspects of what that meant, as well as the technology. And I owned the databases when Lucent spun off LPSS and it became Intrado. I picked up the other 26% of the nation's 911 services. So I had, at the time I left, like 97% of it. There was a company that was doing Sprint and a little bit of New Jersey, but I had everything else. So one of the things that was kind of interesting was we lived through September 11th, 2001. And if you remember how quiet the skies were, there was no planes flying at the time. The first plane in the air was one carrying our parts to start rebuilding what the first tower fell on in terms of 911 infrastructure. We were also the first ones, because we had access into every 911 system in the country, if there was going to be a spike in 911 calls, we knew it first. Somewhere on a hard drive, I still have the spreadsheets with all the peg counts. After Intrado, Verizon asked me to come and rebuild New York City's 911 system. So I was the lead deployment project manager on the world's largest PSAP, or public safety answering point, 1,600 seats of call taking. I built the last two DMS 100s that came off the line. Network ACD, I had 20,000 phone numbers to play with. And then when that system was up and running, I came back to Chicago and landed at Red Sky. And I've been there over 9 years. So it was never planned, but yeah, I know a fair amount about how 911 works from every aspect.
Yes, it does sound like emergency 911 is in the Eisner blood. So,
yeah, no two ways about it.
Amazing. Now, as you were talking, I was thinking that one of, notwithstanding the terrible emergency situations that you've lived through, but one of the massive changes must have been the move to SIP and the impact that had on things like, the believability or the relevance of caller ID. But then I also started thinking maybe this is part of the basis of Red Sky's offering. Because in the old days, if you'd just got a T1 service with a telephone system and some handsets connected to it, things were pretty straightforward.
Yeah, exactly. So Red Sky started out, it was a custom software shop, and there was an incident in Chicago, actually, and it turns out it was in the building behind our office, where woman dials 911, building's on fire. It's a 60-story building. The fire department responded to the address where the circuits were terminated at the PBX in the building. So from 2 blocks away, they go into the basement. They can't see any smoke or fires. They go back. She calls back 7 minutes later saying, "Where are you? It's getting hot in here." And I'm on the 47th floor. So the guys take their hoses and climb 47 stories. They can't find her because the building is as big as a city block. And finally, she calls back a third time saying, "I'm going into the stairwell on the northwest corner." By the time she got there, it was too late. And Illinois became the first state that said, if you have a multiple line telephone system that serves more than 7,000 square feet, you have to provide the location of the endpoint. Red Sky got 3 calls in a row to say, "Can you take my operator database and update the 911 system?" And that became a business.
Okay, and can I just ask, that was pre-VoIP, was it? That was when it was still TDM?
So it was all TDM at the time.
Right.
So as the industry migrated into VoIP and SIP-based, now all of a sudden, instead of having to ask somebody to move your phone, you could just pick it up and plug it into the layer 2 network, and everything was great. The wire guys didn't have to update the switch, but it broke 911. And that was a challenge that we solved almost 15 years ago now.
Right, so originally it was just the fact that on these old TDM systems, people were feeding from the TDM phone system to individual endpoints that could be quite geographically disparate in a massive building, or a different end of a campus or a complex. But of course, that problem was much exacerbated with SIP, because of course people can advertise caller IDs for city codes where they don't even exist.
Exactly. Yeah, so I was involved in my Lucent days at allowing 911 to support local number portability and then geographic number portability. And it was more a database constraint than it was a technology constraint. And then in the central offices, as they started expanding their capabilities to export and support more than one area code, is really what it came down to, then that kind of exploded and allowed people to port their numbers and go anywhere they needed to be. But that too broke 911.
But I guess in essence, now obviously there's differences in practicality, but in essence, the service that you were providing to the TDM people is the similar kind of service to the SIP people, in that you're really marrying up the, where the person sits to what you report to the emergency services.
Exactly. That's the find in find, route, notify.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So it sounds like Red Sky have built up a very, very worthy service offering in doing that, because it's 100% necessary if you are going to rely on the emergency services at any stage for them to know where you are.
Yeah, and as we look about what's really changed over the last 4 or 5 years, it really started in 2018. Congress passed a law called Carey's Law that required a couple different things: direct dialing. So it came from an incident where a child tried to dial 911 while at a hotel and couldn't get through because the hotel required a 9 to get an outside line.
Right.
So the law says you can't do that anymore. And then it required the notification piece. And in the notification piece, it says you have to know where the call came from. So all of a sudden, our business went from it's a nice to have. In the US, there's 23 states that have some sort of regulations on the book, to now it's a federal law that took effect Feb 16 of this year, 2020. And now all of a sudden, we're the pretty girl at the dance, and our calendars are full because enterprises and service providers are understanding that now it's serious. We have to do this.
Right. Okay. And just before we get on to how your life has changed in the as a company in the current set of circumstances, just going back to what you were saying. In fact, I've totally lost my train of thought there. So let's carry on to how things have changed. Oh, yeah, it'll come back to me, I'm sure, Jerry. But so because of your change in legislation, your life had altered anyway as of February this year. But now with the current set of circumstances and the virus and all that kind of thing, has that given you any changes in terms of the demands on your service?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So we have a product that works with soft phones that allows a user to take their laptop or their tablet home, and then if their network location isn't recognized as a corporate location, it prompts the user to say, "Tell me where you are." So I could be working at home. I could go to my mother-in-law's house. I could, if there was a Starbucks open, I could sit outside the Starbucks in my car and work from anywhere I have Wi-Fi connectivity. And yet the corporate enterprise is still responsible, if I use that device to dial 911, to route the call to the appropriate 911 call center based on my location. So we've seen a tremendous shift in the last 3 months of enterprises not only understanding that, but asking us, how do we take care of our new remote work at home workforce?
Right. Yeah, that almost sounds like managing the impossible, because as you said, people can kind of rock up anywhere using a cell phone.
Yeah, so, and it's something that we've been doing for quite some time. And in the competition, it really gets all about user experience. So there are other methods where you just put the responsibility on the user. If they move their device, it's up to them to remember to go in and log into some service provider portal and update their location. We are a little bit more in your face, so we actually pop a screen saying, "I don't know where you are. Please tell me." We validate that, so we make sure that they're putting an appropriate house number and street name that goes with the city and state, and give them a little green check mark saying, "Yay, you did it, congratulations," and know that it's been done. The other thing that it does is it allows the enterprise to say, "Here's a list of people with locations that are valid, and here's a list of people that didn't," and they can go chase them down.
Right. So just thinking, in virus situation, if you've got a travelling sales guy that's hitting, I don't know, 5 different cities in a day, say, he would really need to update that manually 5 times, really.
Yeah. So, and our product runs on Windows and Mac and Android and iOS. In the Android and iOS, we actually take advantage of GPS and we'll suggest where we think you are, remembering that GPS is street level. So the
Right.
fact that it found me in downtown Chicago, it may know my street address, but it doesn't know what floor I'm on or what part of the
Yeah.
building. So the application allows you to fill in that. The FCC calls that combination a dispatchable location. So everything we do is making sure that we're getting to a dispatchable location for every user.
Right, I'm with you, and I was going to answer the question that I was going to ask about using location information from mobile devices. But of course, the other thing is even on laptops, and we find this, when you go onto a website and register for something, it'll come back and say, "I know where you are because I've got your IP address, and we think you're in wherever." Do you try and take advantage of that as well?
So there's a few applications. What we've found is they're not quite as accurate when in an office building as they are when you're at home or in a shopping mall or even in a hotel. And it really comes from how they aggregate their data and how they collect it. Times you'll see the Google Street people, and there are these cars that are all wrapped, but they have like 30 different antennas all over the car, and they're gathering street level data. So again, they may have some idea, but for example, when I sit at my desk, if I take my phone and I turn Wi-Fi off and back on, I hit 30 different Wi-Fi access points, 3 from my company and 27 from other companies. Some are across the street, some are across the river, some are within my building. So it's not really accurate enough for 911.
Right, I'm with you.
It's getting there. And what we found, especially with the GPS, is if you're sitting at a McDonald's, you may not know. But if I give you a list that says McDonald's, you're going to go, oh, yeah, I am at the McDonald's, and
Yeah.
click on it. And now we have the street address.
Right, and yeah, no, I totally understand the sense of it really being the end user that's ultimately responsible for reporting their location. It's come back to me what I was going to ask you a little while ago, and you were talking about how Carrie's law had impacted things and made your service much more relevant to businesses because they need to comply. What about the introduction of the stir, shake and stuff and the validation of caller ID? Has that had an impact on you at all?
So not as much on Red Sky, but in my role, I have a lot of the regulatory and the standards bodies work as well, and it's certainly impacting how when we look at the 911 infrastructure, SureStaken is an issue there because we're looking at how do we protect the 911 network against denial of service attacks. And SureStaken is, especially as we move into what's called next generation 911 and IP based, it's certainly part of the cybersecurity protection or fence that we're building. So it will. In the Red Sky, we rely on the enterprise knowing that they're actually making a 911 call from within their system. And so they need SureStaken stir shaken to protect them. But by the time it's coming to me, it's a private connection that really nobody's going to get to.
Right. Okay. Now you just touched on what's coming next in the world of E911. I would like to come back to that, but before we do, it sounded from what you described as you had quite a nice work-life balance sorted out already before everything kicked off, and you were going to Chicago for a sort of consolidated period of time in the middle of the week. But how has life changed in Red Sky Corporate since the whole virus thing started?
So for the first time, people are, besides me and like one salesperson, people are working remotely. So how we manage people has changed. How we communicate has changed. The lack of what we would call a water cooler discussion or a lunch discussion has gone away, and So we've implemented daily leadership meetings where the top 8 department heads sit on a WebEx conference call, and we go through, this is what's important to ownership. This is what's important to each one of the different groups, our support groups, our engineering groups, our marketing guys, the sales guys, the channel guys, the business people inside who are keeping track of contracts and accounts receivable. And it really, I like it a lot, because if you're not there for the water cooler, you may miss something. And with these daily meetings, I truly hope in some form or fashion that they continue, because it gives everybody a greater awareness of what's going on in the company.
Yeah, absolutely. Although people joke about those water cooler times or hanging around the shared printer or whatever it is, there's quite a lot of information that gets exchanged in those places, which is for the good of the business.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. And being an old guy, Red Sky has a lot of young people that we've hired in every single role that they have. And they may not have the institutional knowledge. So what I fear is that even though they literally can click on a button and they'll show up on one of my screens here, that they don't always do that. Where I could be walking down the hallway and somebody go, can I ask you a question? And I think that's the downside of the remote worker, that getting everybody at every level to know that everybody is still available, or being able to solve a problem and share the solution or ask for help getting that. I think it's more one-on-one instead of a group effort. And I think that's a downside. I do think we're going to struggle to make that up. Luckily, the staff we have, pretty much everybody's been there at least a year and a half. And so there's not a lot of new onboarding going on.
Yeah, that would be particularly difficult under these circumstances, wouldn't it? The kind of induct them and get to know the ropes. So you mentioned the regular leadership meetings. Are there any other kind of rhythms that you've got into, that maybe didn't happen in the first week or two, but you settled down into doing?
Well, personally, for me, it's so important to have a routine. The first week, my lifestyle had to change, because when I'm at home, there's absolutely no reason for me not to get in a car and go to the store and come back and realize that I forgot something and go back to the store and come back, or think of a new project and go take care of that. And it took a week for me to get out of that habit and learn to sit still. The other thing that I think is real important, and you mentioned work-life balance, work's always here. It's not like you leave the office and you want to go sit in front of a screen. There are people working. And, my peers and the partners that we deal with, there's a lot of people saying, oh yeah, I'm working 14, 16 hours a day, because that's what there is. For me, my routine, I don't sign on to any device before 8:30 in the morning, and no later than 5:30 do I sign on to any device. So when I'm done, I'm done. And luckily, physically, my home office is not in sight from being in the rest of the house. But having that balance I think, is really helpful.
Yeah, it sounds a very important thing, and I know that when things are in view, or that you can sign on, there is a temptation to do that kind of out of hours and get on with things, and it's not always the healthiest way to deal with things.
And because of all the changes in the environment, both from the regulatory perspective and the pandemic perspective, I could easily work 20 hours a day and still not get caught up. But it takes that conscious decision not to do that.
Wise words. One more thing on how things have changed in the current set of circumstances. What about your contact with the regulators and the emergency authorities, because I'm guessing that you have to have that to keep up with the regulations and also the practicalities of their communication systems and interfaces with them. Are you still able to talk to them in these times?
Yeah, so we, because at least on the standards body side of things, everybody's a volunteer. We work for either a municipality or a state government or, somebody on the industry or technology side or a service provider. Um, for years, our gatherings have been all remote, all dialing into using some sort of collaboration tool. And
Right.
so that continues to go on. Um, I think the biggest change is because there's so many external things going, it's just harder to get time on people's calendar. That's the big thing. And in Red Sky, we see that our salespeople are having to work harder because the people that they're trying to reach to say, how are you doing this, are busy trying to figure out how to do it. And they don't even have time to take a call. So that's more of a challenge for them than it is for me. I show every night before I go to bed, I show my wife what my calendar looks like for the next day. And she just shakes her head going, all right, I'll bring you lunch. Yeah.
You're kept busy then, Jerry, by the sound of things.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're coming towards an end of our time together, Jerry. I'm very grateful for you plugging us into your calendar like this. But you started to talk about what was coming next in the world of E911 and going towards IP infrastructure and things like that. So I just wanted to ask you the open question: what do you see coming next down the line in the world of E911?
So I want to take it from two different perspectives. The first perspective is those people that own and manage their own telephone system. In the new regulations, it doesn't matter whether it's a key system, a VoIP system, a cloud-based system, you all have the same set of responsibilities. And the congressional intent between both Kerry's Law and Section 506 of the Ray-Baum Act says it doesn't matter how you dial 911, you should expect the same level of service. So if somebody went to their basement and built a free switch and buy PSTN, and now they are serving their friends and neighbors with phone service, they have some responsibility to make sure 911 works in accordance with the regulations. Not everybody understands that. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that. That's the first part. Our nation is slowly moving towards something called Next Generation 911. And the concept of Next Generation 911 is an IP-enabled device will be aware of its location and that there will be a network of networks to consume an inbound SIP call with location and use that location to figure out where to route it. And the routing decisions are much like DNS. You start at the top, what country are you in, then what state, then what region, then what city, and then here's an ACD front end on how to deliver calls to a call taker that's logged in. And it's really that simple.
Can I just stop and ask one question? So did you say that it could be at a global level rather than a national level, the next gen?
Yeah, it really could. So there's another organization called ENA, the European Emergency Number Association. They're adopting similar standards to what we're building here at the National Emergency Number Association here in the US and Canada. So absolutely. And in fact, Canada may be closer to deploying NextGen than we are. So we look at PSAP, Public Safety Answering Point, to Public Safety Answering Point transfers, because obviously a call could, if it's a wireless call, could go to the tower across the river, which in this case may be in a different country. So we have to figure out those types of things, but it's really just all based on boundaries, GIS boundaries. Here's a picture of my country. In it are pictures of my states or provinces or territories, and in those are regions, and in those are cities. So yeah.
Right. And will that change in infrastructure bring any new responsibilities for end users? Like you were just talking about Kerry's Law, that was a change a level of legality that then you can help people comply with. Is it going to be a similar story on the next generation of E911?
Yeah, I think so. So there's a couple things. One, today you get whoever provides your PSTN, if you're an enterprise, is typically where you send your 911 calls. There are third-party service providers like Red Sky who aggregate that, especially in a SIP environment where you may have one SIP server that covers the whole country because it's just IP connections. So in doing so, all 911 calls are routed to us. We use the location to figure out where in the country that call needs to end up. So there's several services that do that. So as you move to this next gen, it's really, there's going to be a change on the 911 side infrastructure to figure out who owns those maps to figure out where to route calls and who owns the SBCs that is going to come from the service provider to get in. NINA, the National Emergency Number, just announced a contract with DigiCert so that you can positively identify the source of a call, that
Right.
it's, and again, you mentioned stir shaken. So now me as a service provider will have our own approved cert that goes in every transaction. So we'll be able to trace where the call is coming from and block people or block calls that don't have the appropriate certs. So there's been some funding in an infrastructure bill that was introduced last year. I've seen funding in a stimulus package bill that's up now. The number that they're throwing around is $12 billion to bring this to the entire US and territories. Where that goes and if it happens, nobody knows. And then also once the money is allocated, is it a 5-year project, a 10-year project? I don't think anybody really understands that either.
Okay, and thank you. Last question. What's the potential for the emergency responder network somehow merging with the E911 network? Do you think that will ever happen? Or
so I think you have to remember that in between the existence of a 911 call and the dispatch of a first responder, police, fire, and EMS, has to be a human being. I've had some discussions on, is there a way to put some AI in between that? But somebody needs to say, I've received a call. Is it a bee sting, a sprained ankle, an active shooter, a building on fire? And then based on that, make decisions. There's tools once you have that information, how to make those decisions. There's tools on once you know that, plus the location on who to dispatch. But just the fact that somebody dialed 911 is not really a trigger to either a mass notification in a corporation or to dispatch somebody. I mean, one of the biggest problems in 911 today comes from cell phones is butt dials. They sit on something and it's interpreted as a 911 call, and
right.
it's not a 911 call. So figuring that part out, I think that human being, you can't forget that.
Yeah, and that butt dialing that you mentioned, that's pretty annoying when you're on the receiving end as a person. So goodness knows what it must be like multiplied however many times over coming into the emergency services.
Yeah, there's been some call taking centers, maybe 20 or 30% of their calls are misdials.
Amazing.
But what it's doing is it's taking up those people from answering real calls. That's really why we're trying to get a hold of, get it under control.
Wasted resources. Well, thanks very much for coming along, Joe. Just remind us of those 3 words that the Red Sky service does that you told us about at the beginning.
Yeah, it's find, route, notify. If you can remember find, route, notify, that's what we do for a living.
Brilliant stuff. Thanks so much, Joe, and I look forward to seeing you at some industry event in the future.
It may be virtual, but I'll be there. Thanks, David.
Okay, all the best.